Imagine spending your entire life trapped underground, raised to believe that the world outside is nothing but death and destruction. But what if everything you were told was a lie? What if the true nightmare wasn't outside, but right beside you the whole time? This is the story of a boy who escapes his prison, only to realize that freedom comes at a terrifying cost. A world on the brink of collapse, humanity struggling to survive, and monstrous horrors lurking in the shadows. Stay with me because this is just the beginning. Want early access to new videos and exclusive content? Become a channel member today and stay ahead of the action. The protagonist begins by describing the old, deteriorating walls around him, the worn-out furniture, and the tiny insects fluttering near the ventilation fans. He envies those insects, crushing one in his fingers. He licks the remains and mutters that he's somewhat am. He has spent his entire life in this basement, writing. He tells himself that when he finally escapes this suffocating place, he will use these reflections he's recording now. Typically, when people start a letter, they begin with their name. But he doesn't know his own. He has never been called by it. Still, he is certain he must have one, given to him by his mother. He was separated from her right after birth, yet he holds onto a faded photo of her in his room. In it, she is holding him, smiling warmly. He is sure that she loved him. She's dead, a man with glasses says beside him. As the man prepares to repeat himself, the protagonist turns, demanding to know what he means. The man, with his sagging, wrinkled face, smirks and reveals that she died shortly after giving birth to him, jumping off a bridge. He chuckles while the protagonist remains silent. This man is his father, the wretched bastard who has kept him locked away in this place. His father's plan is simple: never let him escape. The building consists of endless hallways and countless doors, but every key rests on the man's belt. The father reassures him not to worry, claiming he will never see the outside world. Then, he asks if the boy even remembers the bridge his mother jumped from. The protagonist does not respond. His father picks up a wooden cane and smacks him across the face. He continues, saying that she was afraid, not just of the world but of the earth itself. She knew an apocalypse was coming. The protagonist keeps staring at him, unwilling to react. His father insists that the only reason he remains trapped here is love. He doesn't want his son to meet the same fate, to take his own life. The boy calls him a liar. It's impossible. Why would she choose death over life in a so-called apocalypse? He tells his father to stop spouting nonsense about some impending catastrophe. His father shrugs, saying he can believe what he wants. He then picks up the boy's journal and smirks, warning him that this letter will never see the light of day. The protagonist yells at him to stop, but his father tosses the pages into a burning trash bin. He watches the flames consume his words. Standing over him, the father grins and says he shouldn't be so harsh. After all, everything he does is for his son. He announces that it's time and orders him to start walking through the corridors. The protagonist notes that they take this same path at the same hour every day. He hears no other voices, no other signs of life. It's just him and his father, the only inhabitants of this vast basement. His father scribbles something on a chalkboard as the boy observes. It's the same routine day after day, the same lessons, the same training. The only thing that makes life tolerable is the brief free time he gets to explore the library. Among the countless books, the ones that interest him most are those describing the world outside. He wonders what sunlight truly looks like. Every book mentions it, but all he knows is the dim glow of the basement. He imagines it must be warmer than the artificial light here. He turns his head and envisions a vast, open field. In his mind, he runs through it, longing for a peaceful day, a day where he can admire a beautiful landscape. He wants to talk to people, to make friends. But above all, he wants to escape. A sharp kick brings him back to reality. His father slams a book shut and reminds him that he can only read during his designated free time. The man sneers, noticing his son was reading about the surface again. He mocks him, asking if he still clings to the idea of the outside world. He reminds the boy that he will never leave this place. When the apocalypse arrives, the world will drown in blood and screams. Only the chosen will survive, and this basement is their only hope. The protagonist calls him a liar again. He's always talking about some looming apocalypse. It's the excuse that has kept him locked up his entire life. He swears he will escape no matter what it takes. But the time is not right yet. He needs to wait for the perfect moment, the instant his father lowers his guard. Later, in another room, The protagonist is struggling through a set of push-ups. His muscles tremble, exhaustion weighing him down. His father scoffs, calling him pathetic. If he can't even handle this, how does he expect to survive the apocalypse? He mocks him further, saying it's laughable that he collapsed after only 10 reps, even with such a light weight on his back. The boy's arms give out, and he crashes onto the cold floor. His father steps closer, offering a hand. For a moment, the boy hesitates, confused. Awkwardly, he asks his father why he's helping him. As soon as he took his father's hand, the man yanked him forward and sneered, "I never said I was going to help." In an instant, he swept the boy's legs out from under him, sending him tumbling across the floor until his back slammed against a glass panel. His father stood over him and repeated the lesson. Never trust anyone who offers a helping hand. In the apocalypse, humans are the most dangerous creatures. That's why he had been training him, teaching him combat techniques. One day, he would inevitably encounter other humans. And when that happened, he needed to be strong enough to defeat them with his bare hands. But his father suddenly noticed something. The boy had lost consciousness. Clicking his tongue, he turned away, declaring that training was over for the day. That's when the protagonist saw his chance. His father had let his guard down. Rising silently, he grabbed a shard of glass. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He would end it here, catch his father off guard, take the keys, and escape. A grin spread across his face as he lunged forward. His plan was perfect. All he needed to do was stab the man. He was mere inches away. But then, something was wrong. His father wasn't moving. That man would never let his guard down so easily. As the glass was about to pierce him, his father turned sharply. The boy's eyes widened in shock. His father had anticipated it. Even so, he didn't hesitate. He swung his arm, determined to land the strike. His father dodged effortlessly. In one swift motion, he spun around and delivered a powerful kick to the boy's face. Everything went black. Sometime later, the protagonist woke up in his room. Before he could speak, his father greeted him, saying it was a good attempt, one of his best, actually. But he had already warned him. Using a weapon was a mistake. If he relied on them, all his training would be meaningless. And the penalty for trying was simple: double the training. For now, he told him to rest. Tomorrow would be a difficult day. As the father left, the protagonist muttered that there was something he didn't know. Each night, when the lights were turned off, the electricity in his room cut out for a few seconds. If he focused, he could hear things he never noticed before, distant sounds he shouldn't be able to perceive. The whir of machinery, birds chirping, the hustle and bustle of a city. And from that, he had learned two truths. First, when his father told him it was time to sleep, it wasn't night at all, it was daytime outside. Second, the world wasn't in chaos. The earth was peaceful. His father had locked him here because of some so-called apocalypse. But he would break free, no matter what, and he would find his mother. Whenever he asked about her, his father claimed she was dead. But he already knew the truth. His father always lied. That meant she had to be alive. Lying back down, he whispered to himself. One day, he would escape and see her again. Elsewhere, his father walked through the halls, laughing to himself like a madman. Then suddenly, his expression changed. His phone rang. He answered with a cold tone. "I told you not to call unless it was an emergency." The protagonist, half asleep, could faintly hear something. The conversation sounded serious. His father sighed and muttered, "Fine, I'll let him live." The phone slipped from his hand and hit the ground. His father collapsed to his knees, his body shaking. Then he started laughing again. When the protagonist woke, his father was in the corner of the room, laughing hysterically. Something felt wrong. He tried to move, but then he realized he was tied to a chair. His father had restrained him. Confused, he demanded to know what was going on. He ordered him to untie him, but his father didn't seem to be listening. Realizing he would have to free himself, he began rubbing the ropes against each other, forcing them to fray. Slowly but surely, they weakened. He was confident, but just as he was about to break free, his father appeared before him. "Stop that," he ordered. The protagonist swallowed hard. Something was off. Trying to stay composed, he asked when they would begin the extra training. After all, his father had said today would be twice as hard. His father simply shook his head. "The plans have changed. We won't be doing that anymore." The protagonist's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" His father smirked. "We're done. Training is over." For the first time, the protagonist had no idea what was going on. Something had shifted, but with his hands tied, he couldn't fight back. Doubt crept into his mind. Was he really never going to see his mother? Frustrated, he strained against the ropes again. His father tilted his head, watching him with amusement. "What do you think you're doing?" He didn't answer. He just kept struggling, pulling against the bindings. The ropes started to give way. His father approached, grinning wildly. Then, before he could react, something warm and wet splattered against his face. The chair tipped over. His father lifted him up again, whispering in his ear, "Don't move." The protagonist hesitated for just a second. Then he moved anyway. His father struck him hard in the chest, sending him crashing back to the floor. Even with no clear plan, he kept pulling against the ropes, refusing to give up. He didn't know what had come over him at that moment. Maybe it would have been smarter to simply agree with his father, to wait for another opportunity to escape. But there was something he couldn't afford to lose, not even if it cost him his life. His resentment, the bitterness of being locked away for so long burned inside him. Then suddenly he broke free. The realization sent a jolt of excitement through him. He was free. He wanted to see the look on his father's face, the disappointment in his eyes for failing to keep him under control. But as he turned, his father was already approaching. He expected to see anger. Instead, he saw something entirely different. Tears. For the first time, his father wasn't hiding it. He had been carrying that sadness all along. The boy hesitated, questioning why this man, this wretched man, would wear such an expression at a time like this. Then his father struck him. Everything faded to black. When he awoke, the lessons continued, just like always. His father repeated the rules of survival, the same ones he had drilled into his head countless times before. The most important rule of all: never leave the basement. There was no safer place in the world. This facility had been designed to sustain life for 126 years, with endless supplies and reinforced defenses. Leaving meant death. The end would come without warning. That was why he could never go outside. The protagonist's face pressed against the cold floor. His mind was still hazy, but something was wrong. For the first time in his life, his father was gone. He had never left him alone, not even once except when he was asleep. But he still remembered that expression. Something was happening. The boy had grown accustomed to the repetitive days inside the basement. But today was different. Instinctively, he felt it. Something was about to begin. Then, as if his intuition had become reality, the doors to every room in the facility swung open. Without hesitation, he moved. For the first time, he had a real chance. He sprinted through the open doors, racing down the corridors. Somewhere deep down, he knew, if his father had been there, he would have stopped him already. But there were no obstacles, no barriers, no sign of his father. And then, at last, he saw it, a staircase. This was what he had been searching for. He ran, desperate, his heart pounding in his chest. As he neared the top, he whispered a single plea: "Let the light beyond that hatch be sunlight." With all his strength, he shoved the hatch open. Blinding light flooded his vision. For a moment, he couldn't see anything. His body trembled as he forced his eyes open. And then a city, a bustling, vibrant city stretched before him. People walked the streets, living their daily lives. His breath caught in his throat. He had done it. He had escaped. As he stood there in the middle of the street, stunned, a bald man called out to him. "What are you doing standing there, kid?" The protagonist turned to him, beaming. "I finally found someone." The man gave him a confused look, unsure what to make of this strange boy. But the protagonist quickly realized this wasn't the time to celebrate. It was too soon to let his guard down. If his father noticed he was gone, he would come looking for him. Without another word, he bolted. He ran, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and that basement. As he sprinted through the city, he felt it pure, exhilarating freedom. Not long ago, escape had seemed impossible. He had never imagined the doors would simply open for him. But as he slowed, a thought crept into his mind. Why had the doors opened? It couldn't have been a malfunction. His father was meticulous. He would never make such a careless mistake. What if the doors had been opened on purpose? No, that was impossible. His father had been the one who enforced the rule, never leave. Shaking his head, he forced the doubt away. Looking around, he took in the world around him. People chatting, students laughing, a child chasing after a balloon. A family smiled as they watched their little boy run after it. He let out a breath. This was real. His father had lied. The outside world wasn't some chaotic wasteland. It was peaceful, just like he had always dreamed. His gaze followed the balloon as it floated upward, drifting toward the sun. An apocalypse? That was ridiculous. Nothing about this world looked like it was ending. Then a strange feeling, a sudden shift in the air. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. And then the birds. Every bird in the city took flight at once, fleeing as if in terror. People glanced upward, confused. A massive shadow loomed over the city, and behind the drifting balloon, a planet. A colossal celestial body, swallowing the sun, casting the city into darkness. Everyone stood frozen, staring at the sky. From the massive planet in the sky, something began to emerge, like a virus seeking a host. It moved, descending toward Earth. People stared up, murmuring in confusion. "It's getting closer," someone muttered, uncertain. "What the hell is that?" another asked. "Could it be the moon?" The protagonist scoffed. "Are you serious? Does that look like the moon to you?" As the celestial body drifted closer, something horrifying came into view, a creature. And not just one. An entire mass of grotesque, writhing monsters was connected to it, their bodies forming massive tendrils stretching outward. They surged forward, linking together, extending toward the city below. Never leave the basement. That had always been his father's golden rule. But there was one exception. If the location of the shelter was ever compromised, if they found it, then the rule no longer applied. One of the creatures suddenly launched itself downward, straight into a sewer drain. The protagonist's mind raced. His father had said it himself. If the danger was too great, the rule didn't matter anymore. Inside the underground facility, security systems activated. Doors slammed shut. Meanwhile, on the surface, the people still had no idea what was happening. Then chaos. An endless swarm of creatures reached the ground. It happened so fast that no one even had time to react. A man with blonde hair was the first victim. A tendril shot forward, wrapping around his body. Before he could even scream, he was yanked forward, his face inches away from the gaping maw of a beast. A split second later, his shredded remains splattered across the pavement. Silence, then panic. Screams filled the air as people scattered in every direction. A boy wearing headphones, oblivious to the chaos around him, finally noticed something looming above. It was too late. A massive creature crushed him in an instant. Another, covered in thick muscle, hurled boulders into the crowd. A monstrous figure with razor-sharp claws leaped into the streets, slashing through 3 people in a single swing. The city had turned into a massacre. The protagonist stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Someone shouted to call the police, but it was pointless. Then he remembered his father's words. When the apocalypse arrives, the world will drown in blood. Nothing will remain but piles of ash. He looked up. Towering over the destruction was a creature 3 times the size of a skyscraper. It moved. The ground quaked beneath its weight. One step, half the city crumbled. The apocalypse had begun. Above, the looming planet continued to spill nightmarish creatures onto the earth. Lying on the ground, the protagonist came to a terrifying realization. His father had been right all along. And if he was right about this, then maybe he was right about his mother, too. The citizens tried to flee, but against these creatures, escape was impossible. Then, a hand grabbed the protagonist's wrist. He turned. His father. He opened his mouth to ask how he got here, but the man cut him off. "Run." The boy hesitated. Then he looked back and saw people being devoured before his eyes. A jolt of fear shot through him. His father turned, motioning for him to follow. They ran. All around them, the chaos continued. People screaming, monsters rampaging, blood soaking the streets. A man in a cap yelled, urging everyone to move faster. A girl stood frozen, confusion plastered across her face. Behind them, the horde kept advancing, swallowing everything in its path. The father and son pushed forward, nearing a broken bridge. No matter which direction they looked, the creatures were devouring the city. The protagonist saw the monstrous tide consuming everything beneath the bridge. "This is insane. We're going to get caught. Shut up and run," his father snapped. "This is our only chance to get out alive." The protagonist looked over his shoulder. The creatures were following them. Then something grabbed him. A beast lurking behind a taxi latched onto his leg, squeezing with bone-crushing force. Pain shot through him. If he didn't break free, he was going to die. His father didn't hesitate. He grabbed a stone and slammed it into the creature's head, slicing it apart. The monster collapsed, lifeless. The protagonist clutched his injured leg, groaning in pain. His father glared at him, about to speak. Then suddenly, they felt it, a heavy pressure in the air. The horde was closing in. The boy trembled. He knew he had to move, had to run. But his body wasn't cooperating. The distance between them and the creatures was shrinking too fast. Then pain surged through his leg. He collapsed. He wasn't going to make it. It didn't matter how much he struggled. He couldn't escape. He looked up at his father. "Go," he said, voice strained. "You have to leave me behind. You can still get out of here alive." His father didn't respond. He simply stood there, looking down at him. And then he turned his foot. For a moment, the protagonist thought he was about to run. And maybe that was the right choice. After all, his father had always ignored him. So it made sense that he would abandon him now. But then his father reached out a hand. "Why aren't you getting up?" The boy stared in disbelief. Confused, he shouted back, "You're the one who should be." His father did not hesitate. He simply pulled him forward, insisting that he would survive because he had a plan. The boy found it impossible to believe that his father had prepared for something like this, but as he looked into his face, he realized something. His father's expression never changed when he was certain of something, and he had seen before what he looked like when he was wrong. This was not one of those times. Accepting that his father truly had a plan, he took his hand and started running. As he moved, his mind raced with confusion. If his father had a plan, then what was it? He could not understand, but then he felt something in his palm. His father had left something there. Before he could process it, his father urged him forward, giving no time for questions. The boy had no choice but to obey, continuing to run across the bridge, dodging between abandoned cars as he tried to escape the horrors behind him. He focused on nothing but getting as far as possible. Then something changed. A massive shadow cast itself over him. He turned to look and saw that the support beams of the bridge had given out. The structure was crumbling, and within moments, the entire passage connecting one side of the city to the other collapsed into the abyss below. The realization hit him like a wave. His father had been on the other side. For a moment he stood frozen, his thoughts spiraling. Why had this happened now? Just as he began to question everything, he remembered his father's words. His survival had been planned, but was this part of it? Was his father's sacrifice intentional? Nothing made sense anymore. The man who had tormented him for his entire life had gone to extreme lengths to ensure he survived. But why? Why had he saved him after years of imprisonment? His emotions twisted into a storm of confusion as he collapsed onto the broken remains of the bridge. He was alive, but for what? Everything he had dreamed of, a peaceful existence, a life on the surface, had been torn away. He had longed for freedom, but now, freedom only meant surviving in this nightmare. The life he had envisioned no longer existed. The one goal that had driven him forward was gone. Tears welled in his eyes as he tried to grasp the situation. He wanted to ask his father why. Why had he gone so far for him? Why had he done all of this? The questions burned inside him, but there were no answers. He looked at his hand, remembering the object his father had slipped to him before they separated. Slowly, he began to open his fingers, but before he could fully see what it was, movement on the side of the bridge caught his attention. A creature was climbing up. Panic surged through him. He tried to run, but his injured leg barely responded. His body gave out, and he was forced to lean against a nearby pillar. The monster lunged at him, but in its reckless movement, it lost its footing. The impact cracked the already damaged bridge, sending them both tumbling over the edge. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his entire body. He tried to push himself up, but his leg was useless. The creature recovered quickly, lifting its head and locking eyes with him. He knew there was no escape. This was the end. Yet, as he stared at the approaching horror, his gaze dropped to his hand. The object his father had given him was still there. Finally, he saw what it was. A message. His mother was alive. Shock cut through his despair. How could he have only learned this now? His entire life had been spent believing she was gone. But if that had been a lie, then everything changed. A surge of emotion flooded his chest. He did not want to die here. He could not. There was still something worth fighting for. The creature roared, its massive body preparing to crush him. His father had always said that when the apocalypse arrived, humans would not be able to survive. They lacked the power, the knowledge, or the endurance to continue living in this world. Even those lucky enough to make it through the first few days would inevitably die, unable to cope with the relentless horrors that would follow. The monster charged, and for a brief moment he was paralyzed by fear. Then he remembered something, a conversation from before. He had once asked his father what he planned to do when the apocalypse came. If humans could not survive, then what was he going to do? How would he live? His father had not given a straight answer, but now, his voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of everything he had learned. Instinct took over. As the creature's fist came crashing down, he moved. His body reacted before his mind could process it. At the last possible second, he dodged. The impact shattered the ground beside him, but he remained standing. His own survival shocked him. The monster recovered and prepared another attack, but something was different now. He was not like the others. His father had told him that much. Unlike the rest of the world, he knew how to survive. The beast lunged again, faster this time, but he was ready. He focused, channeling every bit of training and experience he had endured. His father had prepared him for this. He had learned to endure pain, to react under pressure, and to fight without hesitation. That knowledge was the only thing that could keep him alive now. As the monster charged, he moved first. He leaped into the air, grabbing hold of the metal rod strapped to his back. Using every ounce of strength left in his body, he swung, slamming it into the creature's skull. Meanwhile, the city lay in ruins. The few survivors that remained huddled together among the debris. They whispered among themselves, voices filled with uncertainty and fear. Someone questioned why the police had not come yet, while another muttered that they were lucky to be alive at all. Supplies were already running low, despite it only being 4 days since the destruction began. A girl reassured the others that help would come soon, but her words did little to ease their dread. Nearby, a man sat with his head in his hands, frustration written across his face. He listened to the girl's words but soon realized something unsettling. She was not speaking to anyone. She was talking to someone who was no longer there. The weight of it settled over him, but he was too exhausted to say anything. Another survivor approached, breaking the silence. A scouting group had been sent to search for food, but their report was grim. There was nothing left. The man knew that despite their struggles, they had no choice but to find more supplies if they wanted to survive. The girl nodded, mentioning that there was still one place she had not searched. She urged everyone not to give up, determined to keep moving forward. The man smiled at her and expressed his gratitude. She felt slightly embarrassed, but he reassured her that even though everyone was exhausted from constantly running from the creatures, she was still trying to help, proving that she was a good person. She quickly dismissed the praise, insisting she was not as kind as he thought. Still, his optimism did not waver. He remained convinced that they would all make it out alive. Unsure of how to respond, she stayed silent before eventually moving on to check in with the others. She approached a red-haired woman and asked if they had found any food. The woman exchanged a look with her companion before revealing a small loaf of bread. The girl smiled in relief, but then the woman broke it open. Something was wrong. She hesitated, realizing that the bread had already been eaten. Confusion turned to frustration as she questioned them. The blonde girl demanded to know why they had eaten before sharing it with the others, reminding them that everyone had agreed to divide whatever they found. The red-haired woman, however, coldly responded that she had never agreed to anything. That was simply what the others had said. The blonde girl pointed out that both of them had eaten from the shared food just yesterday. The man with short hair shrugged, claiming he did not even remember that. Determined to hold them accountable, the girl announced that she would report them to the others. Immediately, the man stood up, challenging her to try, warning that she would soon regret it. She remained unfazed, simply remarking that it didn't matter because she could outrun them anyway. He chuckled at her confidence and took a step closer. A sudden scream echoed through the area, making everyone freeze. He stiffened and quickly asked his friend if it was a creature. The woman turned toward the sound, analyzing it carefully before confirming that it was. However, since the noise had come from far away, there was no immediate danger. Relaxing slightly, he exhaled in relief, laughing at himself for being scared over nothing. But then, as he glanced to the side, he noticed something strange. The girl who had just claimed she could run faster than them was now trembling, covering her ears as if trying to block everything out. He smirked, mocking her sudden loss of confidence. If she was shaking this much, how could she possibly run away? As she tried to compose herself, her eyes landed on something. In a corner, partially hidden from view, there was a small piece of bread. Time passed, and later, when the same man approached her again, he asked if she had checked the location she had mentioned earlier. She nodded, but when he asked if she had found anything, she hesitated. With the small loaf hidden in her pocket, she lied, saying she had not come across anything useful. He reassured her that it was fine, as it was not surprising given their circumstances. Right now, the most important thing was staying alive. Food could always be found later. Before he could finish speaking, the wall behind them shattered. A monstrous force sent debris flying in all directions. The girl was thrown forward, hitting the ground hard. As she scrambled to her feet, she saw the creature looming behind the man. He raised his hands in desperation, pleading for help. But instead of rushing to his aid, she turned and ran, shouting an apology as she disappeared into the chaos. He screamed after her, demanding an explanation. Her response was simple. She had never claimed to be a good person. The couple from earlier also took the opportunity to flee. The man with short hair urged his companion not to look back. Fixing his gaze ahead, he saw the girl standing before another monstrous figure. The red-haired woman muttered that if the creature killed her, it would create the perfect distraction for them to slip away unnoticed. Internally, she ridiculed the girl for thinking she could face such a threat alone. The monster raised its massive arm and swung. The girl, realizing the danger at the last moment, jumped, narrowly dodging the attack. In her frantic movement, she lost her footing and stumbled, but it worked in her favor. She managed to slip past the beast and reach the other side. The others could only watch as she distanced herself while the creature shifted its attention back toward them. They screamed as it lunged. Later, exhausted and breathless, the girl finally collapsed to the ground. She let herself believe, even if just for a moment, that she was safe. But as she glanced to the side, she noticed something unusual. Someone was there. A boy stood motionless, eyes closed, seemingly asleep. She hesitated before reaching out and slapping him. He fell over, completely unresponsive, continuing to snore. Only then did she realize he was still alive. But before she could process the situation, she heard something behind them. Her body tensed as she noticed a creature creeping closer. Panic surged through her. Had it heard her? Holding her breath, she watched as the monster continued its slow approach. Then, her eyes widened. The boy was completely exposed. If the creature turned just slightly, it would see him. She acted without thinking. Grabbing his shirt, she pulled him toward her, keeping him hidden. The creature passed by. Seconds felt like hours, but eventually it moved on. She exhaled, finally allowing herself to relax. Then suddenly he opened his eyes. She barely had time to react before he jolted upright, startled. He immediately jumped to the other side, demanding to know who she was and what she was trying to do. She blinked in confusion. The boy's mind raced. His father's words echoed in his head. Never trust anyone. Survival depended on keeping others at a distance. If he let his guard down, he would be used and discarded. The girl calmly explained that she had only hidden him so that the monster wouldn't see him. But his father's warnings rang louder. Trusting others was a mistake. If he allowed himself to rely on anyone, he would die. Doubt clouded his thoughts. He questioned how he could possibly believe her. Then his stomach growled. His body collapsed from weakness, hunger overwhelming him. It had been 5 days since he last ate. His final meal had been in the basement. His endurance had reached its limit, and despite his attempts to push through, his body was failing him. The girl stared at him for a moment before casually stating that she had nothing for him to eat. He looked at her in confusion. He had never even asked for food. She quickly tried to correct herself, saying it was just that he looked hungry. So she assumed. But before she could finish her sentence, something slipped from her pocket. A piece of bread hit the ground. The moment he saw it, his attention locked onto it immediately. His hunger intensified. For some reason, just looking at it made his body crave it even more. His mind failed to recognize what it was, but his instincts reacted before logic could catch up. He asked if it was food. Without hesitation, she responded, no. The boy realized he had been wrong. The girl, on the other hand, found it ridiculous that he even considered the strange object to be food. She could not believe she had stumbled upon someone so clueless that he did not even recognize something as simple as bread. Unfortunately for her, the protagonist had no faith in humans. His suspicion made no sense to her, but he was certain. he would not fall for a human's deception. As she processed how absurd this conversation had become, he confidently assumed that, based on her reaction, it was indeed food. He needed it. If she refused to cooperate, he would have no choice but to take it by force. Before he could act, she sighed and tore the bread in half, offering one piece to him. She warned that this was all he would get. She would not give him more. He hesitated, confused as to why she would willingly share if it only decreased her own chances of survival. However, she quickly clarified that he would have to repay her 4 times the amount later. With that, the protagonist reaffirmed his belief that humans were treacherous creatures. After finishing his portion, he stood up. The girl asked where he was going, but he simply stated that now that he had eaten, he could move again. She followed after him, demanding to know where he thought he was going in a world like this. She insisted that she knew this place well, having grown up there. He turned to her, asking if she truly knew the area. She confirmed it, so he immediately asked if she knew where the subway was. Later, as they hid within the city, she questioned why she was still following this idiot. If she had known how strange he was, she never would have shared her food. But then, she remembered their earlier conversation about the subway. When she had asked him why he wanted to go there, he had explained that it was a safe zone, a place filled with the resources they would need to survive. More importantly, the underground tunnels made it difficult for the monsters to detect humans. She found him odd. He spoke as if he knew something the rest of them did not. It was even stranger considering this was the same person who had not recognized what bread was. Eventually, they arrived at their supposed destination, but something was off. She hesitated before admitting that she was certain they had taken the right path. The protagonist immediately called her out, accusing her of lying. He knew that subways were underground, yet there was nothing in sight that resembled an entrance. She quickly corrected him, explaining that they had indeed reached the subway. This was merely the way inside. At that moment, an older man approached them, telling her to be quiet. He explained that he had come because he heard something but had not expected to find people. The protagonist immediately questioned his identity, but the man dismissed his harsh tone, saying introductions could come later. For now, they needed to follow him. The girl hesitated, asking where he was taking them, to which he simply asked if this was not exactly what they had been looking for. After maneuvering through the wreckage of the ruined city, the old man finally stopped, stating that they had arrived. The protagonist looked ahead and saw it, the subway. It was far from abandoned. The place was bustling with people. The girl observed the crowd, surprised by how many had gathered. She had not expected so many survivors to come up with the same idea. The old man reflected on how he had reached this place. He recalled the moment the creatures swarmed the streets, forcing him to flee. By sheer luck, he had stumbled upon the subway and taken refuge. He admitted that he had occasionally returned to the surface to search for medicine, but these two were the first people he had encountered in his search. The protagonist scanned the crowd, processing the situation. His plan had been to establish a base here, but the number of people exceeded his expectations. As he observed them, he categorized them into groups. Some were lost, trapped in despair. Others had begun to reveal their cruel, selfish nature. The strangest of them all, however, were those who remained eerily still, their intentions unreadable. He knew that the more humans gathered in one place, the higher the risks became. Yet, as he continued to watch, he made a strange realization. None of them posed any threat. Instinctively, he could recognize danger, whether from the monsters on the surface or from his father. However, none of these people triggered that same sense of alarm. It was possible that, at least for now, he could afford to stay here. After all, no one here had the ability to harm him. The old man finally took a moment to introduce himself. His name was Huang Bian, and he was a doctor. He explained that his search for medical supplies had led him to find them. Expecting them to introduce themselves in return, he waited. The protagonist remained silent. Instead, the girl spoke up, formally introducing herself as Haru. The man noted her uniform, recognizing it as belonging to a local school called Virtual Elementary. She confirmed this and asked if he was familiar with it. He explained that he had known the area well, as his hospital had been located near the shopping mall right next to it. Haru seemed confused. She could not recall any hospital in that area. Turning his attention to the protagonist, Huang began to ask for his name. However, upon getting a better look at his tattered clothing, he reconsidered, realizing that his question might have been a foolish one. Still, he pressed for an answer. The The protagonist hesitated before giving a simple response. He had no name. The old man was visibly taken aback. The boy clarified that he had never been given one. Huang fell into deep thought before nodding. He told the boy that when he felt comfortable enough, he could share more. Before the conversation could continue, a red-haired woman rushed toward them, calling for the doctor. She reported that the situation was getting worse. They quickly followed her to where a man lay on the ground, his body trembling. He was covered in bandages, his breathing unsteady. Upon seeing him, the injured man called out weakly for the doctor. Huang examined the wound, his expression darkening. He noted that it was far worse than he had initially thought. While he had managed to stop the bleeding before, it had not been enough. The prognosis was grim. If the man did not undergo surgery soon, he would likely die from infection. The doctor opened his coat, revealing an assortment of medical supplies. He calmly stated that they would need to disinfect the wound before proceeding. The protagonist observed him carefully, recalling something he had read once about doctors. Unlike his father, he understood what their profession entailed, treating humans in exchange for payment. However, in this apocalypse, money had lost all value. He questioned the old man, asking what he would gain in return for providing medical treatment. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. The doctor seemed confused by the question, asking why he would expect anything in return. His profession was to care for the wounded. That was simply his role. He reassured the injured man, telling him there was nothing to fear, as he rarely failed in surgery. Overcome with gratitude, the injured man embraced him, thanking him for saving his life. The protagonist could not comprehend what he was witnessing. This man was helping without any form of compensation. If he was not being rewarded, did that mean he was simply a fool? Or perhaps this was just a normal part of human behavior? He could not understand. The doctor remained focused, cautioning the man to be careful as his wound was worsening. The man continued to express his gratitude until he realized something odd. The doctor was a veterinarian. Panic set in as the injured man processed this information. He questioned whether the doctor truly knew how to operate on a human. With an unsettling smile, the old man assured him that he did. After all, humans were animals too. Horror spread across the patient's face as he began shouting that he no longer wanted the surgery. The doctor, unfazed, requested anesthesia. The red-haired woman informed him that they had none. Undeterred, the doctor retrieved a wooden block and used it to knock the man unconscious. The protagonist sat in the corner of the room, watching in silence. He had seen enough. Leaving that place was the best choice. He preferred solitude over witnessing such scenes. Leaning against the wall, he reflected on his current situation. The only things he had now were the photograph his father had given him and the message that claimed his mother was alive. However, he had no clear direction. He lacked any clues on where to go next. His eyes drifted back to the photograph. Every time he looked at it, an odd feeling surfaced. Something about it had always struck him as strange. Even back in the basement, he had noticed that the plants in the background did not resemble any he had seen before. Their shapes were eerily similar to the alien creatures that had invaded. His curiosity had led him to search through countless books on flora, but he had never found a match. If this was a rare plant that only grew in specific conditions, then finding its natural habitat could lead him to the place where the photograph was taken. That meant his next step was clear. He needed to find someone who could identify the plant. As a fly buzzed past, he instinctively caught it and ate it. The bitterness filled his mouth, but he ignored it, lost in thought. Elsewhere, a group had gathered. A subordinate reported to his leader that they had assembled everyone as instructed. A man with a scar turned to face the crowd, declaring that it was time to begin. Murmurs spread among the people. No one knew why they had been summoned. Someone in the middle of the group pointed toward the leader, demanding an explanation. The scarred man did not answer. Instead, he simply stared. The person who had spoken began to tremble. The leader claimed he had the ability to peer into the depths of the human mind, exposing every hidden thought. He observed the man before him, noting the fear in his eyes. Though the man tried to maintain a hardened exterior, the truth was clear. Fear always revealed itself in the end. Without warning, the leader struck him in the stomach, sending him to the ground. The crowd recoiled in shock. The leader crouched down, grabbing the man by the collar. He stared into his terrified expression before smiling. This was what he wanted, to see a person's true self, stripped of their facade. The beaten man begged for him to stop, but before anything else could happen, a woman approached the leader with urgent news. There were still people missing from the gathering. When asked who, she listed an old man, a boy, a young girl, and an injured survivor. Hearing this, the leader frowned. He had given strict orders to bring everyone. She explained that the issue stemmed from a man with a mohawk, someone who never listened to commands. The leader acknowledged that this man was difficult to control, but he decided to handle the matter himself. As he walked away, the woman hesitated before asking what should be done with the injured man on the ground. The leader did not hesitate. He ordered them to tie him up and throw him outside. The crowd murmured in uncertainty. The wounded man pleaded for help, but no one stepped forward. Meanwhile, the protagonist awoke, disoriented. His head throbbed as he tried to recall when he had fallen asleep. For days, he had remained vigilant, keeping watch for monsters. Rest had become a luxury he could not afford. Yet now, without realizing it, he had drifted off. Something was wrong. He had no idea where he was. A sharp pain shot through his head as he struggled to stand. When he stepped forward, his foot sank into something unnatural. Panic set in. Had he been swallowed by something? Or worse, was he already inside the stomach of a creature? A sudden force yanked him upward. His eyes snapped open as he gasped for air, realizing it had all been a dream, but it had felt too real. Confusion clouded his thoughts as he scanned his surroundings. In front of him stood a large gathering of people, all staring at him. He barely had time to process what was happening before a voice rang out. The leader of the group coldly informed him that he had 2 minutes to report to Central Station. If he failed to comply, he would be expelled from the shelter. Whispers spread among the crowd. Someone muttered that the boy should hurry. If he delayed, things would only get worse for him. The protagonist slowly rose to his feet. The leader observed him, disappointment flickering across his face. He had been curious to see what kind of person had dared to remain hidden from his rule. But now, it seemed, his curiosity had been wasted. The protagonist cracked his neck, questioning the situation. One of the men looked at him in confusion, wondering who this lunatic was. The leader, however, found amusement in the moment, stating that this was what made things fun. He commanded the protagonist to look directly at him, wanting to see beyond his exterior, to glimpse the true self hidden beneath his gaze. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he saw nothing. Confusion flickered across his face. One of the men noticed his reaction and asked what was wrong, reminding the protagonist that he only had 2 minutes. But the boy was unfazed. He questioned the time frame, dismissing it entirely. In his mind, 2 seconds would be more than enough to deal with every single person there. A man dropped to his knees, laughing, entertained by the arrogance of the child. Pulling out a blade, he mocked him, asking if those were his final words. At that moment, the leader placed a hand on the protagonist's shoulder. That was when he noticed something. His photo was missing from his pocket. Before he could react, the man with the knife held up the photograph, casually taunting him with it. The protagonist's entire focus narrowed. If there was even a single scratch on that photo, he would make sure the man died for it. His words carried enough weight to make the man pause. Before he could respond, the leader swiftly took the photo from his hands. With a cold expression, he warned that if the boy took another step forward, he would tear the picture in half. Moments later, the protagonist was on the ground, taking kicks from his attackers. One of them mocked him, questioning where all that confidence had gone. Lying there, the boy seethed in frustration. He hated himself for being so careless. Losing something so important while he slept was unacceptable. It only confirmed what he already knew. Humans were far more dangerous than he had anticipated. One of the men asked the leader if the boy was going to be expelled. The leader shook his head, explaining that when he had looked into the boy's eyes, he had seen something different. Unlike the others, his soul was deep, so deep, in fact, that he had not been able to see anything at all. That mystery intrigued him. Because of that, they would keep an eye on the boy and always ensure that the photo remained under their watch. He warned his subordinate to never lose track of it. The man seemed confused, questioning if such extreme precautions were necessary for just one kid. The leader gave no justification. It was an order. Understanding that there was no point in arguing, the subordinate accepted it. Even so, he could not help but think that the entire situation was absurd. As he was about to move on, he noticed something unsettling. The boy was already standing. Despite the beating, he had gotten back on his feet without hesitation. The sight unnerved him slightly, but he quickly dismissed it. None of it mattered. Turning back, he grinned at the protagonist, mocking him for losing his smug attitude. At that moment, Haru appeared. She demanded to know what was happening. The leader barely acknowledged her, brushing past as he casually referred to her as another boring one. She asked if they had been looking for her. Without pausing, the leader simply ordered her to go to Central Station. As he walked away, he commented that he looked forward to seeing the protagonist again, reassuring him that he would take good care of the photo. The crowd dispersed. Haru approached the protagonist, asking if he was okay. Before she could react, he slapped her hand away. She looked at him, bewildered, asking why he had done that. She had only been trying to help. He told her that he did not need help and commanded her to stay out of his way. She refused to back down, correcting him. Her name was not human, it was Haru. She told him to get it right. He simply walked past her, questioning if something so insignificant was even worth remembering. Later, they stood beside Huang Bian. The old man asked if something had happened. Haru sighed, dismissing it as nothing. She merely attempted to talk to someone who did not even know how to communicate properly. Meanwhile, the protagonist remained lost in thought. He would never take the hand of a human. He remembered his father's warning all too well. Anyone who extended a hand should never be trusted. Humans were enemies, but right now he needed to focus. That man had the photo. Taking it back by force would be easy, even if it meant the picture was torn in the process. If it was split in two, he could simply piece it back together. However, he did not want to take that risk. That photo was the only object he had from the basement. The only tangible proof of his past. He would have to wait for the right opportunity. The leader finally announced that everyone had arrived, signaling the beginning of his speech. He presented them with two choices: follow him or choose not to. Those who followed him would not have to worry about being expelled, unlike the man currently tied up before them. He accused the bound man of bringing chaos into the subway, the only true safe place they had left. Because of that, he had been cast out. He claimed that he would not force anyone to join him. However, those who did needed to understand that his word was absolute. The room fell silent. Then, gradually, people began to move. Many exchanged glances before making their choice. One by one, they walked toward him. Huang watched as more and more people left his side. Even the couple that had previously helped him abandoned him. He understood why. In a world where laws had collapsed, the strong always ruled over the weak. The leader had made his stance clear. He would not force anyone to follow him, but the expulsion of the other man was proof of what would happen to those who did not comply. It was obvious that siding with him was the safest option for long-term survival. Still, Huang smiled to himself. He had lived for a long time, and sometimes making unpredictable choices was not such a bad thing. He understood that if he followed the leader, he might not even be allowed to help the wounded when they truly needed it. That was why he would stay even if it meant standing alone. But then he noticed the small girl beside him. He asked if she was sure about staying with him. He warned her that it would be safer for her to go with the others rather than remain here, just the two of them. She pointed at the others, correcting him. They were not alone. The protagonist was still there. The man in the hood had remained, and a frail-looking woman was fast asleep against a wall. The realization sank in. Those who stayed behind would inevitably be captured or tortured by the stronger group. A dark-haired girl spoke up, predicting that they would likely starve to death or worse, become food for the monsters. Her panic escalated, her voice rising as she screamed in frustration. Huang observed quietly. Then, a small girl accidentally bumped into him. One of the men warned the girl to be careful and apologized to the old man for her behavior. Huang Bian reassured him that it was fine and gently told the girl to listen to her father more often. However, she muttered something he could not understand, and when he leaned in to hear her better, she suddenly struck him with a headbutt. She declared that her father was elsewhere, still searching for her. The man with glasses clarified the situation, explaining that she was not his child. He had simply found her while escaping. Since she had no one, he had taken on the role of her guardian until her parents could be located. Meanwhile, the protagonist attempted to pass through a doorway but was immediately blocked. The guards informed him that no one was allowed to enter, as per the leader's orders. Anyone who stepped into that room would be punished. He paid no attention to their warning. The only thing that mattered to him was finding the bastard who had taken his photo. Elsewhere, the group gathered to distribute the food rations. Each person was allowed to take only what had been given to them. A girl who had been sleeping grumbled, complaining that her portion was far too small compared to what others had received. Someone dismissed her complaints, explaining that this was the new system. They were only receiving the minimum because they did nothing but sit around all day. The scent of food filled the air, reaching a man who had been lying down. The aroma stirred him awake, and he mumbled that it smelled amazing. The distribution was nearly finished when someone asked about a particular individual. Another man questioned who they meant. The answer was unsettling: the left-hand man of the leader, a figure known for being dangerously unpredictable. Everyone called him Bomb. Unlike the others, he did not take orders from the leader. He always moved alone. It was well known that he was the type of man who killed with a smile on his face. Tension spread through the group. One man broke into a nervous sweat as the atmosphere grew heavy. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the corridor. A child ran straight toward the infamous figure, colliding with him before pointing at him accusingly. She declared that he had done something wrong. The man, unbothered, simply commented that it was dangerous for her to be running around alone. His clothes were now covered in dirt because of her. Nearby, the men distributing rations noticed the situation and quickly pointed out that he was coming. The tension thickened. Many began wondering if the child had just marked herself as the next victim. Bomb arrived, standing before them. The group tensed, holding their breath as he addressed one of the men. His tone was almost casual as he requested that food be given to the child. The man hesitated, confused. She had already received her portion. Bomb dismissed the concern and instructed him to simply hand over his own share. Without further argument, he took the food and gave it to the girl. The situation left the man rattled. He struggled to understand what had just happened. Why had Bomb given away his own food? Was this some sort of psychological game he had never heard of before? Before he could dwell on it further, someone rushed toward them. It was the man with glasses. He quickly pulled the girl back, telling her to stay behind him. Bomb looked at them with an expression of mild amusement, questioning their reaction. The man with glasses wasted no time, grabbing the girl and leading her away. As she glanced back, she saw the blonde man watching her. He smiled. Back in the main room, many people continued observing the group from a distance. Some of the women whispered among themselves, commenting that more and more people seemed to be watching them lately. The protagonist, however, was lost in his own thoughts. His focus remained on one thing: retrieving the photo. He considered whether it would be easier to simply leave and start searching immediately. As he debated his next move, his eyes landed on Haru. The memory of their previous encounter surfaced, and she had clearly not forgotten either. She scowled the moment their gazes met. That night, when most had fallen asleep, one of the women stood up. She noticed the protagonist sitting alone in the corner. Approaching him cautiously, she reached out to touch his arm. Before she could make contact, he grabbed her wrist with a firm grip. Startled by his strength, she stammered that she had only wanted to talk. He remained unmoved, his cold stare locked onto her. She explained that she had noticed how distant he was from everyone and simply wanted to check on him. He showed no interest, telling her that whether or not he spoke to others was his problem. She hesitated, confused by his hostility. When she reached out again, he slapped her hand away, demanding that she stay away from him. Sighing, she sat down across from him, taking a moment before asking why he always kept his distance from others. She wondered if he was just a shy child. His response was immediate: she was speaking nonsense. He did not avoid people because of shyness. He avoided them because they were enemies. She tilted her head, questioning his belief. He was firm. Every single human was an enemy. He could not trust them. She calmly explained that she had no intention of harming him. He simply dismissed her words, stating that she could easily be lying. Accepting that she would not change his mind, she dropped the subject. Instead, she brought up Haru, suggesting that he should at least make peace with her. The protagonist barely reacted, referring to her as the yellow-haired human. He stated that they had never fought in the first place. The woman took his response as an opportunity. If that was the case, there was no reason for him to avoid her. He remained unmoved, explaining that Haru was no different from any other human. Outside the room, the woman reflected on Haru's behavior. She believed the girl was trying to hide it, but it was clear. Every night, she cried when she thought no one was looking. There was something she wanted to say but lacked the courage to do so. Since she and the protagonist were the same age, maybe they could understand each other. The protagonist dismissed the idea. Sadness was nothing but a weakness. If a person had the time to feel sorrow, then they had time to think of a new way to survive. Her expression softened, and she asked if he had ever been sad after losing someone important. His mind flickered to the moment he had been separated from his father on the bridge. The answer came without hesitation. No, it had never happened, and it never would happen. He did not care about anyone. The woman sighed, telling him that refusing to feel sadness over losing someone was not strength. It was loneliness. Still, she reassured him he did not need to worry. If he ever died, at least she would be sad for him. For a brief moment, the protagonist found himself speechless. The woman's words lingered in his mind, but he quickly dismissed them. She would not feel sad because he would not die. Even if she did, he would not care if she died. She simply accepted his response without argument. He could not understand her at all. To him, she was nothing but an odd person. Nearby, the woman who had been sleeping the whole time groaned in frustration, annoyed by their conversation. All she wanted was for them to be quiet so she could get some rest. For days had passed since he arrived at the subway. Initially, he had only come there to find a place to rest, but now he was trapped. The photo that man had taken still remained out of his reach. Elsewhere, a man was being beaten. A small group stood around him, discussing whether or not they were enjoying themselves. One of them admitted that it was not about enjoyment. This was simply a necessary punishment. The man had refused to leave the restricted room when he was ordered to. The protagonist watched them in silence before speaking. If punishment was the reason, then why not step forward and punish him instead? The man froze. The confidence in the boy's voice was unsettling. He was staring directly at the scene, completely unafraid. Anger flickered across the man's face. If that was what the boy wanted, then he would get what he deserved. The protagonist remembered something his father had once told him. Humans were naturally weak. Until now, he had not fully understood what that meant. But looking at these people, he finally realized the truth behind those words. When he returned to the base, many looked at him in shock, immediately asking if he had encountered the same men who had attacked before. He ignored them, walking past the crowd while deep in thought. At the very least, not all humans were like that. Huang Bian observed the boy and commented that he did not seem too bad. Still, it would be best to disinfect his wounds. The protagonist dismissed the concern, insisting that he was already fine. Someone approached, handing him his meal. She explained that she had taken it for him earlier, unsure of when he would return. He hesitated, preparing to thank her, but the words stalled in his throat. She immediately noticed and urged him to repeat himself. He brushed it off, pretending it was nothing. His thoughts drifted back to something she had said before. She had told him that she had no intention of harming him. She had claimed that if he died, she would be sad. It was possible that she had meant it. Maybe, little by little, he could allow himself to trust her. His train of thought was cut short when she suddenly collapsed. His eyes widened. Something was wrong. Was she okay? The doctor immediately placed her on a makeshift stretcher, assessing her condition. His expression darkened as he explained that her symptoms were worsening. She needed medicine. The problem was that the medication required to treat her was not available in the subway. They would have to go to the surface to retrieve it. She weakly dismissed the idea, stating that it was not worth the risk. Huang Bian disagreed. Without the medicine, her condition would only deteriorate. The protagonist asked what would happen if they failed to retrieve the medication. Before the doctor could answer, a group entered, announcing that the leader was calling for him. One of the men spotted the protagonist and smirked. It was still strange to him why he always had to keep a grip on that photo whenever the boy was around. It was not as if the child could do anything. The photo was nothing more than leverage, yet for some reason, the leader insisted it was important. The man ignored his curiosity and returned to the task at hand. He reminded Huang Bian that there were injured people waiting to be treated. However, the doctor refused to leave. The blond man narrowed his eyes, asking if he was planning to disobey orders. The doctor clarified that it was not about disobedience. The girl needed immediate attention. He could not abandon her just to tend to others first. She weakly pushed herself up, insisting that she could go to the surface herself to find the medicine. Huang immediately shut down the idea, telling her it was suicide. The blond man let out a sigh, claiming that he finally understood the situation. If that was the case, then all they had to do was fix the problem immediately. Without hesitation, he struck her in the stomach. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. Everyone froze, stunned. Even the protagonist, who had barely reacted to anything before, found himself speechless. She collapsed to the ground. Blood pooled beneath her. Huang Bian rushed forward, but it was too late. The protagonist could not look away. He could feel it. Her life was fading right in front of him. Humans died so easily. He remained frozen, unable to comprehend why. Something touched his leg. He looked down. With trembling fingers, she reached out, barely clinging to life. She weakly asked why he looked so serious. He could not answer. She reminded him of something he had said before. He had told her that if she died, he would not care. Her fingers loosened. Her hand fell to the ground. The life in her eyes disappeared. The entire room was silent. The blond man clicked his tongue, irritated that his hand had been dirted. Huang Bian looked at him with disgust, questioning how someone could kill another person and remain completely unaffected. He commented that, in the end, the monsters were not only on the surface. The blond man simply shrugged. He had done them all a favor. If the doctor had followed her to the surface, both of them would have died. He had saved his life. They should be grateful. The room filled with anger. Many glared at him with hatred. He dismissed their emotions, stating that they were wasting their time. Then, something caught his attention. The protagonist stood motionless. The blond man turned to him, smirking as he asked if he was scared. Where had all of that confidence gone? Then, something was wrong. The protagonist's expression did not change, but his body shifted slightly. The blond man's gaze instinctively flicked downward. The photo was gone. He quickly glanced over his shoulder. At some point, he had dropped it. He cursed under his breath, realizing that when he had reached for his knife, the photo had slipped from his grasp. He turned back toward the boy, expecting a reaction. But in that instant, the protagonist was already in front of him. Before the blond man could even form a sentence, the boy spoke. The answer was simple. Yes. From the man's perspective, nothing made sense. He had been looking directly at the boy, but in the blink of an eye, his vision blurred, and the next moment he was struck in the face. The impact sent his knife flying. Before anyone around him could react, his body was already airborne. The protagonist grabbed him by the collar, twisting midair, and delivered another devastating blow, sending him spinning violently across the room. Before his body even made contact with the wall, the boy had already closed the distance. The moment his opponent's head touched the surface, the protagonist grabbed him again, and the knife, previously airborne, landed perfectly in his own hand. It was only then that the onlookers fully understood what had happened. The boy had not only overpowered his target in an instant but had done so with precise control. Now, his opponent was completely immobilized. The protagonist stared down at the man, waiting for any sign of resistance. But there was nothing. Not even a flinch. Irritation crept into his mind. This was the weakness of humans. The moment he attacked, the man had not even attempted to defend himself. He had not reacted when the punch was coming, nor had he shown any sign of knowing what was about to happen. If he had known this man was so weak, he would have taken the photo from him immediately instead of wasting time. Had he done that, there would not be blood dripping down his leg now. For a moment, a familiar voice echoed in his mind. His father. The command was clear. Finish him. No enemy should be spared. A strange sensation built within him. Then, a voice interrupted. Someone told him to stop. He turned to see Huang Bian speaking, warning him that once he crossed that line, there was no going back. The protagonist questioned whether the old man was actually concerned about the life of the man he was holding down. But Huang shook his head. His concern was not for the man. It was for the boy. He told him to ask himself, was this truly necessary? For a brief moment, the protagonist was reminded of something from his past. He had once asked his father if killing was truly the only option. If he simply hurt someone enough, would they not stop attacking him on their own? His father had laughed at him, saying that a person with such thoughts would never survive. Then, he had asked a question, was the boy afraid of killing a human? The protagonist had rejected the idea immediately. He had sworn that no matter what happened, he would never become like his father. Even if the apocalypse came, even if everything fell apart, he would live as he chose. He would not walk around killing people simply because he did not like them. His mind drifted back to the moment the man had killed the woman. He had seen the expression on his face as he did it. That was why he let go of the weapon. Huang Bian remarked that he had made the right choice, but the protagonist disagreed. It was not a choice, it was simply a fact. If he killed this man, he would become just like him. There was no reason for that. He had nothing to gain. He did not care whether that woman lived or died. Even if she had survived, she would not have helped him find his mother. That meant none of it mattered. But what he did not see was the man behind him preparing to strike. Believing the boy was now defenseless, the attacker moved swiftly. However, before he could land a blow, the protagonist reacted. Without hesitation, he grabbed the man he had just let go of and used him as a shield. The attacker hesitated for a split second, but it was already too late. The protagonist threw a punch, sending him rolling across the ground. His body skidded to a stop at the feet of the last remaining man. That one did not attack. Instead, he crouched down. The protagonist narrowed his eyes and asked what he was doing. The man reached for the photo. Holding it up, he asked if this was truly important to him. The protagonist took a step forward, but his expression remained unreadable. There was no doubt. He would retrieve it. The man hesitated, then seemed to reconsider. He carefully smoothed out the creases, wiped it clean with his sleeve, and blew off any dust before extending it toward him. He casually told the boy to be more careful next time. Without hesitation, the protagonist took the photo and walked away. Returning to the group, he noticed that they had already covered the woman's body. Huang Bian asked where the other girl and the child had gone. The man with glasses responded that they had gone to the bathroom. In a way, it was fortunate. They had not been here to see any of it. Then someone called out to the protagonist. A stocky man with a mustache approached, asking why he had done nothing earlier if he was this strong. The protagonist answered simply. They had something important to him. The man raised an eyebrow and pointed at the paper in his hand. Was he really talking about that? The protagonist confirmed its importance but offered no further explanation. Ignoring the conversation, he stepped forward, raising the photo for all to see. He had a question. Did anyone recognize this place? The group examined it, but no one seemed to have any answers. Then, the woman who had been sleeping finally spoke. She asked where he had gotten the photo in the first place. His response was blunt. If he knew that, he would not be asking. The man with glasses commented that if they still had access to the internet, identifying the location would be easy. Huang Bian finally asked why the boy cared so much about finding that place. The protagonist found the question ridiculous. The answer was obvious. He was going there. Huang Bian's face shifted. He had already seen that the boy could fight, but he also understood reality. It was impossible to survive out there. But the boy remained unfazed. He stated with certainty that he would survive. The others looked at him in confusion. His thoughts drifted again. He had not expected to find anyone who would recognize something from the photo. Then someone entered the room. The leader, observing the situation, he let out a small sigh. It seemed things had finally escalated. His eyes landed on the object in the protagonist's hand. Without hesitation, he declared that the man had failed to follow even the simplest order. Rolling up his sleeves, he stepped forward. There was no need for discussion. This would be resolved intuitively. Meanwhile, on the surface, a creature wandered. Its body twitched as it sensed something below. Without hesitation, it began digging, tearing through the ground. Beneath it, directly beneath the subway station, the earth trembled. In another section of the underground, a small group had gathered around an improvised fire. Haru stood nearby, silently watching. Then, a small voice echoed behind her. The young girl had returned from the bathroom, her expression filled with annoyance. She loudly declared that everyone here was ridiculous. No one had flushed. Haru sighed, telling her that it was inevitable. None of the toilets worked anymore. The man approached, advising them to return quickly. Haru tensed, preparing for resistance, but he assured her that he was only doing what was necessary to survive. From a distance, another person near the fire pit observed, casually commenting that it looked like a fight was about to break out. Before anyone could respond, something fell into the pot. The group turned, confused by the sudden disturbance. They moved closer, wondering what had caused it. Before they could make sense of the situation, more debris rained down from above. Looking up, they realized the ceiling was breaking apart. Then, before they could react, something massive dropped through the opening. The creature was already upon them. Meanwhile, deep inside the subway, the protagonist stood face to face with the leader. Around them, his subordinates lay sprawled across the floor, unconscious or worse. That confirmed something. This man was unlike the others. The protagonist had encountered people like him before. In the underworld, he had crossed paths with monsters long before the real creatures arrived. These were individuals who defied normal human limits, whose very existence set them apart. Now, with actual monsters roaming the surface, there was little difference between them and people like this. One of the leader's subordinates, still conscious, shouted a warning, urging caution. He insisted that the boy was far stronger than he appeared. Before he could finish, the leader struck him down with an elbow to the face. Irritation flickered across his features. He despised being called incompetent. But none of that mattered. What mattered was putting the boy in his place. Stepping forward, he analyzed the child, noting his sharp, rebellious gaze. This was something that needed to be corrected. The boy had no idea who was in control here. That would change. He was going to tear through whatever was hidden inside that soul. He reached out, imagining himself pushing through a thick barrier, parting the darkness with his hands. But as he forced his way forward, something was wrong. The darkness did not give way. Instead, it swallowed him whole. Realization struck. He had made a mistake. He had assumed that he was the one peering into the boy's soul. But the truth was far more horrifying. The boy was looking into his. Panic surged through him as an unseen force crushed his mind. His body recoiled violently, and he fell backward, gasping as if he had been on the verge of being devoured. His subordinates turned in alarm, unsure of what had just happened. The protagonist, however, remained completely still, watching them all in silence. The leader could barely process what he had just experienced. He had been moments away from death. He was certain of it. Those around him could not understand. Behind him, a woman observed with confusion. Why was he acting this way? Why was he shaken in front of a child? Then, a scream echoed from the entrance. A man stumbled into the room, calling for help. Blood soaked his body as he staggered forward. Someone rushed toward him, demanding to know what had happened. The injured man struggled to speak. He had been feeling a strange headache for some time, but something had changed. Something was emerging from him. One of the onlookers hesitated, asking if it was a monster. The injured man could barely form words. Something inside his head was trying to get out. Before he could say more, his body convulsed violently. Then suddenly he stood upright again. Everyone froze. Then, something tore through his skull. A sharp appendage shot outward, piercing the air. Instinct took over. The leader reacted instantly, recognizing the threat. With a brutal punch, he sent the man flying, throwing his body against the wall. The corpse twitched, preparing to rise again. Without hesitation, the leader grabbed his axe and struck, severing the mutation. The remains collapsed beside the body. Everyone exhaled in relief. The creature had stopped moving. It was over, but something was wrong. The leader frowned. Where had this thing come from? The others relaxed, expressing relief that they had survived. But the protagonist remained still. Something was off. Then it happened. The door burst open. A new creature emerged. The room fell into silence. No one could move. The monster rose, towering over them. Perhaps because they had spent so much time underground, they had forgotten. Or perhaps they had been trying to ignore what they knew. The memories they had tried to suppress clawed their way back. Then, everything fell apart. One by one, people dropped their weapons. Then they ran. Panic spread through the group. Survival instinct took over, overriding everything else. The leader's voice cut through the chaos, demanding to know how long they planned to keep running. Would they repeat this forever? He raised his axe, reminding them of the difference. This was just one. Unlike before, they could win. Maybe it was because they had just witnessed a monster being killed, or maybe his words actually reached them. Something changed. For the first time since the world fell apart, they felt hope. One by one, they turned back. They picked up their weapons. They could do this. The girl beside the leader turned, waiting for his command. Then her hope shattered. The leader was dead. The monster had torn through his body. His corpse was lifted into the air. The room fell into a stunned silence. He had just been alive. He had just been fighting. Yet now his lifeless body dangled, motionless. The creature discarded him, and blood splattered across the floor. Shock rippled through the survivors. One of them whispered that it was impossible. The monster had been killed, so how had it come back? The realization struck everyone at once. This could not be defeated. The walls of the subway shattered. More monsters flooded in. The chaos erupted instantly. A man who had been boasting just moments ago did not even have time to react. He was torn apart. A woman stood frozen as the beast approached. She could not move. Then she was gone. The blond man barely had time to lift his weapon before he was ripped apart. Blood soaked the walls. Screams filled the air. Everyone was running now. Some tried to fight. None of them lasted. The protagonist stood in the corner, watching the massacre unfold. From a distance, others inside the station could hear the destruction. The sounds of death. Someone murmured that it was only a matter of time. One by one, they would all die. The man with glasses could only think of one thing. The girl. He clenched his fists. He had to find her, before it was too late. Huang Bian reached out, grabbing his arm. He asked where he was going. The man turned, his expression firm. His child was still out there, and he had to find her. Huang Bian did not hesitate in his response. If the creatures had already reached that area, then the girl was dead. The man with glasses refused to believe it. He had already experienced this before. Losing someone while being unable to do anything could not happen again. But before he could act, someone else moved past him. He turned, and the room fell silent. Every set of eyes locked onto the protagonist's back as he walked toward the chaos. Huang Bian's voice rang out, urging him to stop. But the boy did not even flinch. From the doorway, everyone watched the blood-soaked room ahead. The protagonist only continued forward. Elsewhere, Haru, the young girl, and the man who had been with them remained hidden. The child trembled, tears welling in her eyes. Haru whispered for her to stay quiet. This was not the time to feel sorry for anyone. Survival was all that mattered. She had found a place to hide, but she knew that the moment she was discovered, she would die. But the child clung to her arm, shaking. Haru turned, unsure of what to say. In the end, she could only tell her to stay close. Then, footsteps echoed. The blond man appeared, standing over them. His voice carried frustration, demanding to know where they thought they were going. Fear crept into Haru's chest. She answered simply, "They had to run." The man scoffed, asking where she thought she could possibly run to. There were monsters here. There were monsters on the surface. What made her believe she would find any path to survival? But she remained firm. She had no idea where she was going. She only knew that she would not stay here and wait to die. No matter what, she would fight to live. For a moment, the man studied her. Then he understood. There was still something in her eyes, a reason to keep going. But before he could say anything more, he stopped. A monster was watching them. The reality of the situation struck, and he shouted for them to run. Haru, however, was frozen. Her legs would not move. She could not escape. The man made his decision. Throwing himself at the creature, he grabbed hold of it, yelling for them to get away. He had no reason to live. They did, but as he turned his head, expecting them to hesitate, they were already gone. He let out a bitter laugh. They could have at least let him finish his speech. Elsewhere, survivors fought desperately against one of the creatures. Many had already fallen. A woman in a suit lunged at the monster, attacking without hesitation. The injuries she inflicted healed instantly. A tendril lashed out, sending her crashing into the wall. She barely remained conscious, already knowing the truth. They could not win. Then the protagonist walked past her. Every eye in the room followed his movements. What was he thinking? Where was he going? The plant-like creature continued its rampage, using the leader's corpse as its puppet. From the floor, the woman watched him, realization settling in. He was going to fight it. He was going to die. Not even their leader had survived. The protagonist, however, remained calm. The creature moved first, its tendrils snapping forward. He dodged easily. Then he moved in. Grabbing hold of the monster's body, he pulled as he threw himself forward. It reacted immediately, aiming to strike his neck. But before it could land a hit, he leapt backward, using the wall to reposition himself. Twisting in midair, he landed behind it. With every movement, the monster's body tangled, its own limbs working against it. The struggle intensified. Its arms no longer reached, could not attack. Its own body had become a trap. The protagonist turned his gaze toward the leader's corpse. Stepping forward, he ripped the parasite from his body. For the first time, the room fell silent. Huang Bian could not believe what he had just witnessed. The monster had been stopped. The woman scoffed, uninterested in the reaction. The leader was still alive. That was all that mattered. A moment later, the creature let out a scream. Every other monster in the vicinity turned toward it. The protagonist tossed the parasite to the ground. Another giant approached. The instant it lunged to attack, the protagonist moved first. A massive jaw snapped shut, but he was already gone. Pivoting, he struck it under the chin with his knee. He slipped past its reach, rolling beneath its arms. Another monster opened its stomach, preparing to consume him whole. He simply jumped. Landing on its back, he yanked the axe from its corpse. The creature reacted violently. Blood sprayed across his face. Blinded for a split second, he barely had time to react. A crushing blow was aimed straight at him. The others gasped. They were sure it was over, but he still stood. Huang Bian could not process what was happening. To everyone else, this was impossible. The monsters were overwhelmingly powerful. They were capable of instant regeneration. Fighting them was suicide. Yet in front of them, a child was winning. The protagonist remained still, recalling something his father had always said. Nothing in this world was immortal. Everything that existed had a source, a beginning, and that was what had to be cut. The monsters attacked. He dodged. He analyzed. His father had always believed that if it were him, he would see it. The exact location where life began. And, more importantly, how to destroy it. His strike landed. The creature froze. Then, slowly, it began to crumble. And that's where we'll leave it for today. If you made it this far, you're a real legend. Thanks for sticking around. What do you think of the protagonist's insane abilities? Is he really just a human, or is there something more to him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more epic stories like this. And of course, hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.